I grew up in a musical family. My mum and her siblings, they grew up singing together in church, and they still sing. They like to break out into song, whether they were asked to or not. For example, my auntie Valerie, I love her a lot, except when we were younger, we used to go to their house during the holidays. And she likes to wake us up with a good morning song, nice and early. And it's always different. It's always in a different key, but it's Auntie Valerie. My Uncle Peter Goltz. I'm sure there's some people here who are familiar with this song, The Sower. It's a classic kids song. If you don't know it, it's a good one. It's a really good one. But I am 100% convinced that my Uncle Peter is the one who made this song famous. You can try and prove me wrong, but once you see him with his guitar, with a crowd of kids around him, no one can out-sing him, especially when it comes to that last line, when you hold the word seeds for as long as you can. You cannot out-sing Peter Goltz. My mom and her younger brother, Matt, also sing a lot. I could only dream to play guitar and sing as well as my uncle. But you see, there's one song in particular that my family as a whole takes very seriously, and that is Happy Birthday. If anyone knows the Goltz clan that I'm talking about, we're notorious for our happy birthday. It usually starts with one of my uncles giving us a starting note. He'll hum a note, and then he'll count us in, and then we'll continue to sing in any note but the one he gave us. So we'll all choose a different key to sing in. Sometimes we like to choose our own tempo, and while we're at it, we also like to choose our own melody. Because the song Happy Birthday isn't classic enough, we just have to remake it ourselves. So it's kind of just a big production that we put on for people. It's a lot of noise. And it's even more interesting when someone decides to have their birthday celebration in a public place, like a restaurant. I'm never going to forget the one time at Montezuma's when they came out with their maracas and their big sombreros. And they start singing Happy Birthday, but then we all join in, and they were so shocked. They didn't know what to do, so they just left the cake on the table and turned around while we went for round two. Yeah, it's always a fun time with the Goltz clan. But the ironic thing is that we actually all can sing, like in time and on key, as shocking as it may be. Especially with some of the noises that comes out of our mouths. But we can sing. And all my cousins and I, and my siblings, we all grew up singing in church, leading worship in church, doing items. My sister and I, that was something that we did for a long time when we were younger. But it was really only when I was about 16 that I started to understand what worship meant. And I'm still on this journey, a few years later. But I remember I was asked to sing, and it was the first time I'd ever sung alone. I'd always accompanied someone. I'd always been in a group. I'd never sung on my own. And like the stage fright started kicking in, and I was like getting this nervous sweat. I was worried I was going to forget my lyrics. In hindsight, it's always funny to look back because it was like for a discipleship event at my home church, and there was like 10 people in the crowd. But I just remember thinking, this is the performance of a lifetime in my 16-year-old mind. And I was stressing about it because I was like, I don't know how I'm going to do this. And I worked myself up into this panic. And it was only once I sat down with my youth pastor that he explained to me, he's like, why are you so worried? Like, just sing. Like, you're singing to God. So just sing to him. Like, don't worry about what people think. Don't worry that you're up there alone, because you're not. Like, this is between you and God. Like, this is the heart to heart. He ended up playing with me. His guitar skills were a lot better than my 16-year-old skills, and I'm pretty sure I haven't improved since. But I just remember in that moment, like I just forgot about everyone around me. And it just became about me and God. And it was just a conversation. It was just a song. It was just me showering my praise for his faithfulness to me. And I never forgot that moment. When we think of worship, what often comes to mind? Like, what's the first thing that comes to mind? I know for me, the first thing that jumps in my mind is music. Maybe when I say worship, it's a bit more specific. Maybe the first thing that popped in your mind was coming to church and singing together. But what else comes to mind? Because, over the last few weeks, as a church, we've spoken about mission and giving and service, which are all acts of worship. And yet at the core of it, there's a why. Why do we do it? Why do we worship in this way? It can be way too easy to kind of just go through the motions of things that we've just always done. We slip into the habit of singing songs because we like the song, or maybe we just like to sing. Or we give because Lauren gives a fire sermon about giving. Or we serve because we've committed to serving in a space, and sometimes even that can be difficult. So why do we do it? What is at the core of worship that makes it so important, that is so needed? I'm going to be reading from 1 Chronicles chapter 13. I'm reading from the NIV version, so feel free to read along. I'm just going to read the first 11 verses first. It says, David conferred with each of his officers, the commanders of thousands and commanders of hundreds. He then said to the whole assembly of Israel, "If it seems good to you, and if it is the will of the Lord our God, let us send word far and wide to the rest of our people throughout the territories of Israel, and also to the priests and Levites who are with them in their towns and pasture lands, to come and join us. Let us bring the ark of our God back to us, for we did not inquire of it during the reign of Saul." The whole assembly agreed to do this because it seemed right to all the people. So David assembled all Israel from the... I'm sorry, my pronunciation of some of these words are going to be shocking. We'll say Shihor River in Egypt to Lebo Hamath to bring the ark of God from Kiriath Jearim. We're going to run with that today. David and all Israel went to Baalah of Judah to bring up from there the ark of God the Lord, who is enthroned between the cherubim, the ark that is called by the name. They moved the ark of God from Abinadab's house on a new cart, with Uzzah and Ahio guiding it. David and all the Israelites were celebrating with all their might before God, with songs and with harps, lyres, timbrels, cymbals, and trumpets. When they came to the threshing floor of Kidon, Uzzah reached out his hand to steady the ark because the oxen stumbled. The Lord's anger burned against Uzzah and struck him down because he had put his hand on the ark. So he died there before God. Then David was angry because the Lord's wrath had broken out against Uzzah, and to this day that place is called Perez Uzzah. Whenever I hear that name, my brain seems to only comprehend it in the most Aussie accent, Uzzah. So it took a lot of restraint to let loose there. And just to clear up a few things, in case anyone's wondering what we're talking about here, there's mention of the ark of God. And the ark of God was one of the most instrumental symbols of faith and God's presence, like for the Israelite community. It was an ornate, gold-plated wooden chest that in biblical times housed the 2 tablets of the law given to Moses by God. And the ark rested in the Holy of Holies inside the tabernacle and was seen only by the high priest of the Israelites on the Day of Atonement. I have a diagram. I don't know if you can see it very well. So this is the tabernacle, and Moses was given very specific instructions from God when building it. I'm not going to go through the entire process of what was involved when it came to the Day of Atonement, but what's important is right in the center there. It's kind of small, but it's the brazen altar. That's kind of important. It was kind of significant because this is where people, on the day that they would atone for their sins, this would happen once a year. Everyone would come and they would sacrifice something. That tent, and this is also a very simplified version, I'm so sorry. The tent at the back, this is a really special place. So here we have two sections. There's a lot of labels here, I'm sorry, it's the only diagram I could find. But this first section on the right side is the holy place. And that little back section that's divided by this veil, this inner veil, is the Holy of Holies. So we already have a really holy place. This was a holy place. But then inside of that was a holier place, a Holy of Holies. And what was in there, that's where the Ark of God would sit. And this was so important because only one person in this community could really go in there, and it was once a year, and the high priest would go in there. And here's a bigger picture of the ark. And you see these angels, the cherubim. In between is, I'm really hoping I get this right, and I apologize if it's not, but in between is what rests the mercy seat, and this is where God's presence would sit. And this is why it was so holy, because this represented God dwelling among his people. This is after a time when they had been captive in Egypt for years, for generations, and God had just delivered them and said, not only have I delivered you, but I'm going to dwell with you. And this is why this is so important, and this is such a significant artifact. It's not the physical thing, it's what it represented. I'm hoping that made sense. There's something about the ark that's almost charismatic. There's something about it and what it stands for that makes God's people want to dance and sing. It's not only important, it's exciting, but it's holy. See, David, the first time, so in chapter 13, when he sent people to go and bring this ark to this temple that he was building for God, he had disregarded all of the rules and the systems that God had put in place originally for this ark. He had disregarded that, and he said, go grab it, bring it here. And he was excited, don't get me wrong, his intentions were good. But his familiarity, was that how you say it? His familiarity with God it almost was a little bit irreverent, because there was no respect for the rules that God had put in place. And so here, David's anger gives way to fear. However important and exciting the ark may be, it is clear that there is also something slightly dangerous about it, which is an odd word to use, and this is the best way I can explain it. This is one of my favorite quotes from C.S. Lewis, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. It says, this is a conversation between Susan and Mr. Beaver, and he says, Aslan is a lion, the great lion. Oh, said Susan, I'd thought he was a man. Is he quite safe? I shall feel rather nervous about meeting a lion. Safe, said Mr. Beaver. Who said anything about safe? Of course he isn't safe, but he's good. He's the king. He's the king, I tell you. The fate of Uzzah is a fearful warning against over-familiarity with God, because his attitude to the thing should have been as reverent as his attitude to the person. That is the meaning of holiness. That's what sets him apart from every other god, every other being. The ark belongs to God. It is specially his. It's consecrated to him. Therefore, it is to be regarded with appropriate awe and treated with appropriate respect, because it's holy. We're going to skip to chapter 15, where this story kind of picks up again. And in verse 1 it reads, After David had constructed buildings for himself in the city of David, he prepared a place for the ark of God and pitched a tent for it. Then David said, "No one but the Levites may carry the ark of God, because the Lord chose them to carry the ark of the Lord and to minister before him forever." David assembled all Israel in Jerusalem to bring up the ark of the Lord to the place he had prepared it. He called together descendants of Aaron and the Levites. The next couple verses kind of list a bunch of names of all those people who were called together. I'm not going to try to pronounce them, so we're going to move to verse 12. And he said to them, "You are the heads of the Levitical families. You and your fellow Levites are to consecrate yourselves and bring up the ark of the Lord, the God of Israel, to the place I have prepared for it. It was because of you, the Levites, did not bring it up the first time that the Lord our God broke out in anger against us. We did not inquire of him about how to do it in the prescribed way." So the priests and the Levites consecrated themselves in order to bring up the ark of the Lord, the God of Israel. And the Levites carried the ark of God with the poles on their shoulders, as Moses had commanded in accordance with the word of the Lord. David told the leaders of the Levites to appoint their fellow Levites as musicians, to make a joyful sound with musical instruments, lyres, harps, and cymbals. I love that it always ends with this big shout of praise. But there's something that changes in David's heart. From the end of chapter 13 to the beginning of chapter 15, something changes, something flips, something clicks for him. He became convicted. A notion of what we think reverence might involve has to become a conviction in both heart and mind of what God says it actually does involve. To David, the ark, for all its antiquity, it's a central feature of his people's religion. So he had to go back to the Maker's instructions to find out about its proper handling. There's a big question here, so what? The ark is something that kind of doesn't, we don't have our tabernacle with the ark in the holy place, in the holiest of holies. And when the chronicler was writing this, at the time, the people he was writing it to, the people who were reading this, they also didn't have possession over it. So what was the point? Why bring it up? It's all very well for him to write so enthusiastically about it and about Israelite worship in the days of David, but he's centering in on the thing that they don't actually possess anymore. But this was the point, because the ark of God, it meant the covenant. It meant the ark of the covenant of God. That's what I'm trying to say. This God is unique among the gods of nations. He is Yahweh, the one who came to rescue his people from slavery in Egypt and to make them his own through the great encounter at Sinai. It's there that he decreed that he would be their God and they be his people forever. That was his covenant. The Lord, Yahweh, is his covenant name. And therefore, the Lord is the object of the continual praise of Israel. And once more, as if to clinch to the point, the ark is the focus of this praise. And that's what we call it, the Ark of the Covenant. The covenant of God means the grace of God. And that was very wordy and probably didn't make a lot of sense. And it's probably coming across really confusing. And so this has put it so much better. I like the way Louis Giglio kind of talks about worship and grace here. And he says, there is a symbiotic relationship between the grace of God and worship. Symbiotic is just a big word that means you can't have one without the other. It's like breathing. You can't breathe out unless you've breathed in. And you can't breathe in unless you've breathed out. And it's that way with grace and with worship. Where there is no grace to be breathed in, there is no worship to breathe out. And there is worship to be breathed out because there is grace to be breathed in. And this is reflected in our tabernacle because we have the altar out here. And the altars are set up because the ark is there. It's not vice versa. He's showing us, it's shown that the ark takes precedence over the altar. And what I mean by that is that the nature of things, that the gift of grace must precede the response of faith and the promise contained in that truth. So if the ark is a symbol of God's grace and the altar is a symbol of people's response, then the relationship between the two is so important and they can't be separated. So when the readers, the ones who would have originally read the chronicler's writings, they would have asked that obvious question. Why preach to us about the ark? We have no ark. But I love his response. And he says this, and this is also my response to our church. It says this: you do not need an ark. Grace is not bound to your religion or your faith. It precedes them, and they are simply a response to it. Grace is not bound to particular places or circumstances. People must be prepared for God to come down to them from anywhere. And grace is not bound to its symbol, the ark, either. Grace is free. God is pouring out his grace upon you here and now, ark or no ark. And he'll be doing so when the entire system of the Old Testament Israel, the priests, the kings, everything is ancient history like it is. Never say, therefore, that if you go here or there, if you do this or that, God will be bound to bless you, because his grace is bound to nothing at all except his own love and goodness. Fortunately so, because while everything else is changing and unreliable, that is constant. I've heard it put another way, and I really love this, because earlier this week, it was very timely. I was listening to a short message from Brooke Lidgetwood. She's one of those people when she steps forward to lead worship, or when she steps forward to give a message. She's someone who almost makes me feel closer to God, because you can tell she spends so much time in the Word. And everything she says, it just feels so biblical, and I love it. But she shared a story from when she first became Christian, and she was at her first church, and it was the Salvation Army. And in their chapel, off to the side, there was what they called a mercy seat. And basically anyone could come up to it and share this one-on-one intimate moment with God. And she shared that she spent so many times pouring her heart out to God at that mercy seat. And as she got older and as she got to know God more and she developed her relationship with God, she realized that mercy seat was also beside her in her car. She realized that mercy seat was beside her bed at night. She realized that mercy seat was next to her on her porch. She knew she could encounter God in worship wherever she was at. It was a lifestyle, not just a moment. So my question for you is, will you approach the mercy seat of God? I'm just going to invite the band back up. And as they get ready, I just wanted to read something to you. What is worship? Worship can be thought of as affection, attention, obedience, awe, or credit given to God, inwardly or outwardly, in recognition of his worth or works. This practice has always been central to the people of God. When King David neared death, he called the Israelites together and reminded them of the implications of their status as God's people. They were a people formed around a specific purpose, praising the Lord. So what does it really mean to worship God? Worship is first and foremost a response. When God's people glimpse the majesty and beauty of God's supreme worth, they don't pause to calculate whether the lyrics or melody fit the sight. They just respond. True worship bursts from a heart that has seen the Lord. He is surrounded by praise at all times. The creatures surrounding him react and respond to his glory, the radiance of his collective perfections, and they never stop speaking praise. Of all the people and things that humans treasure, God is infinitely greater and infinitely more satisfying. He is the ultimate object of awe. Worship involves much more than music. It includes how God's people live every day, recognizing God's glorious nature has an impact on the choices made. God desires a lifestyle of worship integrity, a wholeness, a seamless quality between what his people profess to believe and the way they live. Obedience is the fruit of true worship. God's people attend church services on the weekend and sing with enthusiasm and intensity, yet it is Monday that will prove whether or not that was worship. If the end of the songs at church mark the end of their worship, then something's wrong. True worship expresses gratitude for God's provisions and works, who is faithful like God. His kindness can be seen in the memory of last year, last month, and last night. He is good to his people. He gives breath today. He provides for every need in the past. He answers prayers. For his name's sake and for the good of his people, he has unlocked, opened, diverted, thwarted, arranged, rearranged, and removed, all as blessings to his beloved daughters and sons. Sing the praises of the Lord, you his faithful people. Praise his holy name. True, authentic worship comes from the posture of our hearts as a response to God's grace. That's why we do it. That's the core of worship. To be sold out to God's grace, we need to be sold out in our worship. So authentic worship is an every moment experience with the lover of our souls, not just a few songs at a church service. It's not a formula or a program or a production. It's our heart attitude glorifying God in everything we do. So my constant prayer is that God will change our hearts. Thank you.